Okay, good to see you. I'll start in English and then I'll go to French. So first and foremost, of course, I would like to reiterate how much I personally and this government is against any form of anti-Semitism. And we know that there's been a rise of anti-Semitism across this country. It has worsened since October 7th. We've heard from the Jewish community from coast to coast to coast how much this was a problem. And we need to continue to fight every day, working with mayors across the country, working with premiers. And of course, we have, as a government, to do a better job. And we all have to do a better job, everyone in the House of Commons. And so we'll continue to denounce any form of anti-Semitism that is happening on our streets, in our schools, against hospitals, synagogues, etc. Why? Because we, as a government, believe also in the Charter, in the fact that freedoms need to be protected, not only freedom to speech, but also freedom from intimidation, violence, discrimination. Now, when it comes to the leader of the opposition, Pierre Poilievre himself, let me be clear. What we saw yesterday was the height of hypocrisy. Clearly, Poilievre is doing one thing and saying one thing, and he's doing another. I'll give you 3 examples. First, while he's saying that he's fighting anti-Semitism, he never condemned those who were waving a Nazi flag during the Freedom Convoy on this Parliament Hill. Why didn't he? Second, he cozies up to groups like Diagolon, who spread neo-fascist ideology across this country. Why does he denounce their anti-Semitism as well? And also, when his caucus met with far-right politicians from Germany that were downplaying Hitler's crimes, he kept them in his caucus, and they're still sitting next to him in the House of Commons. So clearly, what we're seeing is that Pierre Poilievre is about double standards, and he's about himself, his own political gain, and ultimately, he's unfit to govern this country. I'll say it in French. Bien entendu, il va de soi que le gouvernement, on est contre toute forme d'antisémitisme. Toute forme d'antisémitisme qu'on voit dans nos rues, qui vise la communauté juive. Et on le sait très bien que l'antisémitisme est en croissance partout à travers le pays, particulièrement depuis le 7 octobre. Et c'est inacceptable. Et moi-même et notre gouvernement, nous allons toujours le dénoncer. Et nous devons travailler avec les maires de Montréal, maires d'un peu partout à travers le pays, avec les premiers ministres. Et bien entendu, nous devons travailler tous ensemble pour faire un meilleur boulot parce qu'on doit contrer ce fléau. Ce n'est pas une question politique, c'est une question morale. Alors nous allons continuer d'agir et de le dénoncer. Et en même temps, ce qu'on va faire, c'est qu'on va continuer à défendre la Charte des droits et libertés. Parce que c'est ce que le gouvernement libéral, nous, on croit. On croit que les gens doivent avoir le droit, la liberté d'agir, de parler, mais aussi, ils doivent être protégés de la liberté des autres. Et il n'y a certainement pas de droit d'intimider ou de violenter ou de discriminer. Et c'est ce qui unit notre pays et c'est ce qui fait partie de notre legs, nous, en tant que gouvernement libéral. Mais lorsque vient la question de Pierre Poilievre, lui, il dit qu'il combat l'antisémitisme. Mais la réalité, c'est que c'est 2 poids, 2 mesures. Premièrement, Pierre Poilievre, il dit qu'il bat contre l'antisémitisme, mais en même temps, il n'a jamais dénoncé les gens qui flottaient un drapeau sur la colline parlementaire durant le convoi de la liberté, qui était un drapeau nazi. Il n'a jamais dit rien à l'époque. Encore aujourd'hui, il ne dit rien. Il doit le dénoncer. Deuxièmement, son caucus, les membres de son caucus se sont assis avec des politiciens allemands d'extrême droite qui sont venus au pays, dont L'objectif était de banaliser les crimes commis par Hitler. Les membres de son caucus n'ont subi aucune conséquence. Ils sont assis encore à côté de lui dans la Chambre des communes. Et troisièmement, Pierre Poilievre, il se tient avec des groupes comme Diagolon qui font la promotion d'idéologies néofascistes un peu partout à travers le pays et qui sont au cœur de l'antisémitisme qu'on voit partout à travers le pays. Et donc, lorsqu'on pense à Pierre Poilievre, c'est pas compliqué. Tout est basé sur lui-même et tout est basé aussi sur ses propres gains politiques. Donc, clairement, ce gars-là, il n'est pas fait pour diriger le pays.
I just want to reiterate a couple of things that Minister Joly said. It is unacceptable and it is wrong to see anti-Semitic protests in our streets. And it is wrong to denounce Canada and to say the things that we heard over the past 24 hours in our country. But when it comes to Mr. Poilievre, he is lying to Canadians when he is talking about what is happening in the chamber. He is pretending that what is going on in there is something completely different than what it is, which is a conservative filibuster of conservative obstruction. The Speaker of the House was extremely clear when he ruled on the conservative question of privilege. He said that because of the extraordinary circumstances, this should go to committee for further study. There is only one political party that is holding things up in the House of Commons right now, and that is the Conservative Party of Canada, because they are afraid that if this study goes to committee, what they will hear from experts is that this is an egregious abuse of power. But this is a consistent pattern with Pierre Poilievre and his Conservative Party, where they obstruct the truth, they try to spin away from reality, but the facts don't lie. The facts are, and any one of you can go and read this testimony, this ruling from the Speaker, where he clearly states that this matter should be referred to the Procedure and House Affairs Committee for further study. And Mr. Poilievre doesn't want that to happen, because when that happens, expert after expert will come out and say that this is an egregious abuse of power by the Conservatives, and just because the House has the right to do it does not mean that it should. Monsieur Poilievre est en train de ne pas dire la vérité aux Canadiens. C'est clair qu'il veut continuer d'obstruire son propre obstruction dans la Chambre des communes. Il ne dit pas la vérité aux Canadiens avec ce qui se passe dans la Chambre dans ce moment. Et ça, c'est un patron du leader et son parti conservateur qu'on voit jour après jour ici dans cette Chambre. Et il y a une raison que je crois qu'il ne veut pas suivre la direction qu'a donnée le président de la Chambre, qui était très claire. Envoie cette motion au comité pour qu'on puisse l'étudier plus, parce que c'est un abus de pouvoir. Et il ne veut pas que ça arrive parce que ça va être clair. Expert va dire que c'est un abus du pouvoir et c'est inacceptable de ce qui fait le leader de chef des conservateurs. Et les Canadiens sont intelligents. Ils savent quand quelqu'un est en train de dire la vérité. Et je sais que M. Poilievre sait ça aussi. Et c'est pourquoi il est en train d'essayer de faire des confusions sur ce qui arrive. Mais la réalité, c'est que nous sommes là, on veut travailler, on veut envoyer cette matière au comité, puisque nous pourrions terminer avec le travail qu'on a besoin de faire pour les Canadiens.
Madame Joly, juste une chose.
Oui, juste si vous n'avez rien à vous reprocher là, pour ces documents qui touchent ce fonds vert, pourquoi vous ne les envoyez pas seulement à la GRC, si, comme parti, vous n'avez rien à vous reprocher?
Le gouvernement est toujours là pour travailler avec le GRC, mais ce n'est pas la procédure appropriée. Les chambres de communes ne peuvent pas demander ces documents. Ils peuvent demander ces documents, mais c'est la première fois dans l'histoire du Canada, donc il va l'envoyer au GRC sans la procédure judiciaire, sans l'indépendance de la GRC. C'est le GRC même et l'auditrice générale qui ont dit que ce n'est pas correct, que ce n'est pas comment nous travaillons dans une démocratie. Et je m'excuse, mais je dois aller parce que la période de questions commence et je dois être là. Merci.
Madame Joly, vous pouvez rester, vous, sur M. Poilievre.
Une question, oui.
Sur M. Poilievre, Poilievre, il vous demande de vous excuser, vous, parce que vous avez refusé de condamner les slogans. Pourquoi est-ce que vous ne faites pas juste condamner les slogans?
Mais je les condamne. Je les condamne à tous les jours. Premièrement, lorsque vient la question de l'antisémitisme, je le condamne. Le Hamas est un groupe terroriste. On a sanctionné le Hamas. J'ai dit hier que, justement, on condamnait le Hamas. Ça faisait partie des premières choses que j'ai dites lors de ma réponse, après avoir nommé les 8 Canadiens qui ont été tués. Donc, moi, j'ai pas de problème à condamner le Hamas. J'ai pas de problème à condamner l'antisémitisme. Pourquoi lui, il n'est pas capable?
Samidoun?
Samidoun be made into a terrorist organization?
Of course. I've been calling upon that for the last year, and there's a national security review being done on Samidoun, and it absolutely should be a terrorist organization. It promotes hatred. It's a spokesperson for a listed terrorist organization, and its activities over the last few days have only made it very clear that it has to be done.
What do you think of the ongoing dispute between the Foreign Affairs Minister and Mr. Poilievre? Is Mélanie Joly pandering to...
I'm not going to comment about... You can ask me a substantive question. I'm not going to talk about personalities. Anti-Semitism in this country is a serious issue. The demonstrations have had anti-Semitic rhetoric that has been floated out, and to use October the 7th, a day where 1,200 Israelis were murdered, the worst day for Jews since the Holocaust, to do what was done in a number of places yesterday, and to make anti-Semitic in statements and glorifying terrorism and glorifying what happened on October 7th is an absolutely horrendous thing that should not happen in Canada. And anyone who was part of those demonstrations, what happened at McGill where a building was vandalized, it's absolutely disgraceful. So whatever differences there are between the parties, I think and I hope we all agree that October 7th is a day that has to be remembered for what happened and not used by people who don't like Israel to terrorize people in Canada.
How optimistic are you that Samidoun will be designated a terrorist organization?
I'm very optimistic. I believe that what Samidoun has done justifies it. And I'm confident our national security agencies and then Cabinet will take the right steps.
Is it not technical? Like, are you satisfied with how long, I mean, the evidence as you say is there?
Yeah. Look, I would have liked it to be done a year ago, but I don't believe that politicians can control when the national security agencies report back and what they say. But again, I think it needs to be done expeditiously. I know the minister. I've talked to him, if not hundreds of times, more than 50 times about this issue, and I'm very confident he sees it the way that I do.
Mr. Poilievre said yesterday about that he would support Israel striking nuclear sites in Iran, as well as the oil production facilities. Is that something that you think your government should be taking a position on? Would you support that?
Look, I've taken positions a number of times that are different than my government on Israel. I think Israel has an absolute right to defend itself against Iran and its terrorist proxies. And I think Iran having nuclear weapons is a great danger for the world. Have a great day. Thanks, guys.
I think I'd have to read and better understand some of the things that they're doing, but probably a strong case to be made.
And do you think, or I should ask you, what do you think overall about this back and forth that we've seen in the last couple of days between Mr. Poilievre and your Foreign Affairs Minister?
I spoke to 1,500 people in Winnipeg yesterday from the Jewish community. I sat in a memorial service with 600 people at an all-Jewish school with the student population and the teachers in Winnipeg. Parents pulled up to the school that morning and dropped their kids off in the backdrop of police cars and police officers because of the rise in anti-Semitism. This place is about politics, and I can appreciate that to an extent, but I would prefer that we keep ourselves focused on people that are being impacted on the ground, and I think that there's a lot in our political discourse these days, particularly around the issue of the Middle East, that is not only proving to be divisive, but also distracting from I think, the important conversations that we have to have and the important reparation that needs to happen amongst community members across the country. So I'm not going to provide any further comment. I think you've seen how I engage on this issue, and it's not the way I choose to engage, and I hope that my colleagues, broadly speaking, will always choose to depoliticize sensitive matters whenever the opportunity arises for them to do that. Okay. Well, that's a lot of politics too. On this one, I'm not going to speak too much because as chair of PROC, there's a good chance that this will come to us, and my job is to be an objective observer and a decision maker on that front. But it seems to me that the Speaker's ruling is relatively clear, and now the usual back and forth of who the political onus rests on will play out for a little bit. I think some of my colleagues are certainly aware of how much time can be eaten up and taken away from the legislative agenda as this conversation ensues. But should it come to PROC, if that's the prerogative of the chamber, as per the Speaker's recommendation, then I'm certainly looking forward to having that conversation. I'm sure it'll be an interesting one. Okay, thanks, guys.
Yeah. What did you want to add about it?
Well, you had asked me the question about whether or not I thought they should be listed as a terrorist organization, and that's not really a decision for me as an individual member of Parliament to make. There's protocol in place and criteria that needs to be undertaken in order to establish whether or not a group ought to be listed a terrorist entity. But what I can say with certainty is that what we have seen members of this organization do and say is not only reprehensible and has no place in Canada and needs to be condemned in the strongest of terms loudly by elected officials and grassroots everyday Canadians from coast to coast to coast. But it seems to me that there is likely a very strong case to be made that there are hate crimes that are being committed in the context of what they are doing and saying. Like I said about whether or not they ought to be established as a terrorist entity, that decision is not one for me to make. That's obviously one for the police to determine if they believe that a law is being broken, and for the courts to enforce, for the courts to rule on following that enforcement. So even though it's not up to me as an individual member of Parliament to decide, that does not take away from very strong feeling that I have towards what they are doing and saying, and my belief that what they are doing and saying, Samidoun that is, does not belong in Canada, and that there needs to be a much stronger vocalization of that from everybody, inclusive of ordinary Canadians across the country.
And I guess your government is undertaking a review. It sounded like today Jennifer O'Connell said that it was being passed along to the National Security Advisor.
I can't speak to that. I'm not aware of exactly where things are at in the process. So again, I do think as individual members of Parliament, we have to be very careful to say, yeah, I think just because I despise this group and what they're doing, I think they should be called terrorists. We can say that what they are doing is terrorizing people, but to take the step of actually categorizing them as a terrorist group within Canada is obviously a substantial one, and we do have to ensure that rules and procedure are followed. Like I said, though, short of making the determination that I think would be inappropriate to make because of those processes, I still think it's very much acceptable for somebody such as myself, other elected officials, regardless of political party, and Canadians across the country to strongly condemn what they're hearing and seeing. And I don't think that it is crossing the line for us to say that they are terrorizing people and that the actions that they are undertaking are, I would hope, in the minds of all Canadians, contrary to the values that are instilled in us here as a people. I hope that adds some clarity. Okay,
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Do you know, are the Bloc talking to the Liberals? Are they negotiating?
What I heard is that we're still negotiating.
Sur l'Iran, un petit mot, M. Poilievre dit on doit frapper les sites nucléaires. Israël devrait frapper les sites nucléaires iraniens. Vous en pensez quoi au Bloc?
J'en pense que il y a longtemps que l'Iran développe son potentiel nucléaire. Il y a longtemps que si on avait voulu empêcher l'Iran de développer son potentiel nucléaire. On aurait dû agir. On a essayé sur le plan diplomatique. On a vu les effets, on a vu ce que ça a donné sous le gouvernement de Donald Trump. Maintenant, est-ce qu'il est encore opportun aujourd'hui de frapper les cycles nucléaires? Est-ce qu'on ne risque pas de donner lieu à un embrasement généralisé du conflit dans la région et même au-delà? Je pense qu'il faut qu'on se pose sérieusement la question.
Je vous pose des questions.
Mais je pense que ça mérite effectivement réflexion.
Mais vous êtes pour ou contre un soutien à Israël advenant des frappes qui vont jusque-là?
Je pense que c'est extrêmement dangereux.
Et ce que M. Poilievre dit, c'est dangereux aussi, donc, qu'il donne son aval à ce genre de frappe.
Je trouve ça extrêmement dangereux. Dans le contexte actuel, considérant le fait qu'on ne connaît pas l'état d'avancement du développement du potentiel nucléaire de l'Iran, je trouve ça extrêmement dangereux.
Merci, bon après-midi.
Poilievre not being able to speak today. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm amazed that someone who throws such a cheap and vicious slur gets a day in the doghouse and then comes back and then throws vicious slurs the next day. This man wants to be Prime Minister of the country. He's expected to set a standard, and he just refuses all the time.
Well, we saw two speakers' rulings today. We saw the Pierre Poilievre one, but we also saw the Yvonne Baker one. Do you think it's fair, the treatment of both of them? One wasn't allowed to speak for like 6 months, the other is just for 1 day. Do you think that's a fair thing?
No, absolutely. The situation in the House is very confusing and difficult because we do see two sets of standards. What happened with Mr. Baker, I think, is completely unacceptable. This is a passionate MP who's speaking up on Ukraine. And yet he's been silenced in the House, whereas we see really low-grade, vicious commentary continuing from the Conservative benches, and I think the Speaker seems intimidated by them, and he certainly seems intimidated by Mr. Poilievre.
Do you think this is setting a dangerous precedent? Because it seems that they're using this ruling with Poilievre as a way to bring Baker back without having him need to apologize or retract. Do you think this will now just allow people to say whatever they want and just they get a day off and come back, or how do you see this being?
Well, I'm concerned that when a would-be Prime Minister makes such a vicious slur and refuses to retract, sets a really dangerous precedent.